The moment Susanna Yates stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the blazing summer of 1879, the dust swallowed her whole, and she thought to herself that perhaps that was exactly what she deserved, to disappear into something vast and indifferent, the way she had always disappeared into rooms full of louder, prettier, more certain women. She was 24 years old, recently widowed after only 8 months of marriage to a man who had been kind but distracted, a bookkeeper in St. Louis who had caught a fever in February and never recovered from it. She had no children, no real family to speak of, and a small inheritance that amounted to enough to start over but not enough to start grandly. So she had answered an advertisement placed in a Kansas newspaper by a woman named Mrs. Clara Holt, who needed a seamstress and housekeeper at a boarding house in Caldwell, a cattle town that sat right at the edge of the Kishom Trail. Caldwell in 1879 was not a quiet place. It was loud, dusty, sunbeaten, and full of the kind of energy that came from cattle drives ending and cowboys beginning to breathe again after months of hard pushing north from Texas. The streets were wide enough for wagons and horses both, lined with saloons and general stores and a blacksmith shop whose hammer rang out like a bell from first light to last. There was a church that held services only when the traveling preacher came through, and a small schoolhouse that doubled as a meeting hall, and enough bawdy houses and drinking establishments to ensure that the law, such as it was, stayed constantly busy. Susanna stood on the wooden boardwalk in front of the stage depot with her 2 travel bags at her feet and looked at all of it with the careful, contained expression she had spent a lifetime perfecting. She was not a woman who broadcasted her feelings. She was, as she had told more than one person in her life, plain and ordinary, plain of face, ordinary of manner, unremarkable in every way that the world seemed to measure women. She had brown hair that she kept pinned neatly, gray eyes that missed very little but revealed even less, and hands that were already calloused from years of sewing and housework. She was not beautiful in any way that stopped men in the street, and she had long ago made her peace with that, or at least she had told herself she had. Mrs. Clara Holt found her quickly enough, a stout, cheerful woman of 50 with an iron handshake, and a voice that carried over the general noise of the street. She took one of Susanna's bags without asking and started talking immediately, leading her down the main road toward the boarding house 2 streets over. "You'll find Caldwell lively," Clara said, in the tone of someone who had learned to call every difficulty an adventure. "Cattle season brings all manner of men through, and not all of them are trouble. I want you to know that. Most of them just want a clean bed and a decent meal and some peace and quiet before they start the whole business over again. You'll do the mending, some cooking when cookie's back is bad, and you'll keep the rooms in order. The pay is fair and the room is yours privately, which is more than most women your age can say." Susanna thanked her and meant it, because Clara Holt was right. Privacy, after the chaos of the boarding house she had stayed in briefly in St. Louis while settling her late husband's affairs, felt like an extraordinary gift. The boarding house was called simply Holt's, and it was a 2-story wooden building with a wide front porch and geraniums in boxes beneath the windows, which struck Susanna as the most hopeful thing she had seen in weeks. Inside it was clean and smelled of beeswax and faintly of coffee, and Clara's other 2 permanent boarders, a retired telegraph operator named Mr. Fenwick and a schoolteacher named Miss Dolly Carr, were both quiet people who kept regular hours. The cowboys who came and went during cattle season occupied the 4 front rooms on the upper floor and were subject to Clara's rules, which were posted on a card above each door and were not negotiable. Susanna unpacked her bags in a small room at the back of the 2nd floor that looked out over a kitchen garden, hung her spare dress on the peg behind the door, set her sewing basket on the table by the window, and sat down on the edge of the narrow bed. She pressed her hands together in her lap and breathed slowly. She was in a new place. She was starting over. She was going to be all right. She told herself all of this firmly, the way you tell a stubborn horse which direction it needs to go. The first week passed in a blur of learning, where things were kept, how Clara liked the linen folded, which boarders took their coffee black, and which took it with molasses because real sugar was used sparingly. The front rooms filled up quickly as a drive came in from Texas, nearly 800 head of longhorns that raised a dust cloud visible from a mile out and a noise that rattled the window glass. The cowboys who stayed at Holt's were mostly young men, sun-dark and lean, who were polite enough when Clara was watching, and who left their boots muddy on the porch steps despite the sign that asked them not to. Susanna learned their names by the end of the first day, because she was a woman who paid attention to names. There was a cheerful young redhead named Pete who could not stop laughing at his own jokes. There was a very tall man called Sutter, who spoke so rarely that his occasional sentences landed like official announcements. There was a pair of brothers named Tomas and Enrique from the south of Texas, who played cards together every evening on the porch and argued in rapid Spanish that dissolved into laughter more often than not. And then there was Jeremiah Vaughn. He came in last, after the others had already claimed their rooms and eaten their first supper at Clara's long table. Susanna was clearing dishes when she heard the front door open, and she looked up from pure habit, the way you look toward any door that opens when you are in the same building. He was tall, not dramatically so, but enough that he had to tip his hat brim to clear the doorframe out of long practice. He was somewhere around 30. She guessed sun-aged in that way the frontier-aged men, so that the exact number was difficult to determine. But his eyes were a clear brown with a quality of patience in them that struck her as different from the weary impatience she had seen in the eyes of the other men who had come through the door that week. His clothes were trail-worn and dusty, and he carried his gear over one shoulder with the ease of a man who had been carrying things a long time. He had a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown, and a scar along his left cheekbone that had faded to silver, and his hands when he set his bag down on the floor of the entryway were the largest, most capable-looking hands Susanna had ever seen on a human being. None of that, she told herself firmly, was her business or her concern. Clara came out of the parlor and greeted him with the warmth of someone who knew him from before. "Jeremiah Vaughn, you look like the trail chewed you up and had second thoughts about swallowing you." "Evening, Mrs. Holt," he said, and his voice was low and measured, the kind that did not waste itself. "Sorry for the late arrival. Had a situation with one of the steers at the stockyard. All settled." "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Your usual room is taken, I'm afraid, but I've got the corner room on the second floor which is quieter anyway. Supper's done, but I've kept a plate." "That's more than I deserve," he said, and meant it without false modesty. His eyes moved through the room in the natural way of a man who catalogued his surroundings as a matter of habit, and they landed briefly on Susanna, who was standing at the kitchen doorway with a stack of clean plates in her hands. She met his gaze because she was not the sort of woman who looked away first out of shyness, and he gave a brief, respectful nod. "Evening," he said. "Good evening," she said, and went back into the kitchen. She did not think about him again that night, or at least she told herself she didn't, and she was almost convincing. The next morning she was in the garden before sunrise, cutting herbs for Clara's kitchen, when she heard boots on the back porch steps, and turned to find Jeremiah Vaughn standing in the early gray light with a coffee cup in his hand, and a look of mild surprise on his face that suggested she was the last person he had expected to find outside at this hour. "Morning," he said. He was already dressed for work, clean shirt, vest, hat settled back just slightly on his head the way men wore them when the sun hadn't come up yet. "Didn't know anyone else kept early hours." "I've never been able to sleep past first light," she said simply, going back to her cutting. "I find it easier to simply rise and do something useful." He came down the steps slowly and stood at the edge of the garden looking out at the flat, pale Kansas horizon where the sky was just beginning to show the first thin wash of gold. He drank his coffee and did not fill the silence with noise, which she noticed. "You're new," he said after a time. "Since last week." "Where from?" "St. Louis most recently," she said. "Originally Missouri, farther south." He nodded. He did not ask more than that, which she appreciated as well because she was not in the habit of offering her history to strangers. "How long do you stay?" she asked, because it was a practical question that had to do with how many sets of shirts she would need to mend and when. 2 weeks, maybe 3, he said. "Depends on how the sale goes and whether the boss needs any of us for the return trip. I usually stay on through the sale and then head back to the Texas Panhandle for the winter work. And in the spring, you come north again." "Every spring for 6 years," he said, with a slight note in his voice that might have been something more than simple reporting, but might just as easily have been the quality of the morning light. The sun broke the horizon then, and the whole flat plain turned copper and amber, and the garden went from gray to green in an instant. And Susanna straightened up with her herbs in her hand and looked at it because she never, ever got tired of sunrises, not anywhere she had ever been. "Beautiful," she said, without thinking that she was saying it out loud. "Yes," Jeremiah Vaughn said, and she had the brief, odd sensation that he was not talking about the sunrise at all, but she kept her eyes on the horizon and decided she had imagined it. She didn't think she had imagined it. Over the following days, Caldwell kept its usual loud and complicated pace, and Susanna settled into the rhythms of Holtz the way she had always settled into new places. Quietly, efficiently, making herself useful so quickly and thoroughly that people forgot what it had been like without her. She mended shirts and patched canvas, and altered a vest for Mr. Fenwick, whose middle had expanded since the vest was made. She helped Clara in the kitchen and swept the upper floor hallway and replaced the candle stubs in the hall sconces every morning. She worked with the deliberate steadiness of someone who found purpose in effort and did not need an audience for it. Jeremiah, she noticed, was not like the other cowboys in the ways that mattered most. He was not louder in the evenings because he had been drinking. He did not leave his things where someone else would have to deal with them. He was among the first to sit and among the last to get loud, and when he came to the supper table he waited until everyone else was seated, which was a small thing but which Susanna, who noticed small things, logged carefully. He was also, she discovered, a man who read. She found this out on the 4th evening when she came through the parlor to leave a folded stack of mended laundry at the foot of the stairs, and found him sitting alone in the straight-back chair by the window with a book open in his hands. The other men were at the saloon, or playing cards on the porch. He had a lamp tilted close and he was deeply into whatever he was reading, one booted foot crossed over his knee, and he looked so entirely at home in that attitude of concentrated quiet that she stopped moving for a moment. He looked up and she moved again quickly, setting the laundry down. "Sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to disturb you." "You didn't," he said, and folded a corner of the page to mark his place, which she noted was not exactly how you were supposed to treat a book, but was at least evidence that he intended to go back to it. "I'm not precious about quiet." She glanced at the book and could just make out the binding. It was a novel, she thought, from the size and thickness of it, though she could not read the title from where she stood. "What are you reading?" she asked before she could think better of asking. He turned it so she could see the spine. It was a copy of Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, and it looked like it had been read at least twice before, the binding worn soft with use. "I've read that," she said. He looked at her with a sharpened attention, the sort you give someone who has just said something you didn't expect. "Have you?" "3 times," she said. "My father had a small library, for a Missouri farmhouse anyway. I've read more than most people think to ask me about." There was a pause, and then something shifted in his expression, not dramatically, not in any way she could have described precisely to someone else, but it was real. It was the particular look of a person who has been alone with a thought for a very long time and has just discovered, unexpectedly, that someone else has been thinking the same one. "What did you make of it?" he asked. She considered the question as seriously as it deserved. "I think it's about what we owe each other," she said finally, "and about how wrong we can be about where our worth comes from." He was quiet for a moment, turning that over. "Yes," he said slowly. "Yes, I think that's exactly right." She nodded and took her leave and climbed the stairs, and halfway up she realized she was smiling, which was not a thing she had done without noticing it in quite a long time. 3 days later, the situation with Pete's horse came up, and Susanna found herself more involved than she had planned to be. The young redhead had come back from the stockyard limping and pale-faced, and it turned out his horse had thrown a shoe on rough ground, and Pete had gone down hard and twisted his ankle, though by some mercy it wasn't broken. He was laid up in his room with his foot raised on a rolled blanket and a general expression of suffering that was slightly more theatrical than his actual pain warranted. Clara put Susanna in charge of bringing him meals and making sure he was comfortable, and Susanna did both with brisk efficiency. But Pete, to his credit, was genuinely worried about his horse. "Someone needs to check on Biscuit," he kept saying. "He threw the shoe on the right front and he was favoring it and I couldn't get to the blacksmith before." "I will go," Susanna said, which surprised him and, if she was honest, surprised her slightly as well. "You know horses?" he asked. "I grew up on a farm," she said. "I know enough. Where is he stabled?" The livery was 2 streets over, and Susanna made the walk in the mid-morning heat with her bonnet on and her practical stride, and she found Pete's horse exactly as described, a wide-eyed golden animal with a white blaze on his nose who was indeed favoring his right front hoof. She talked to him quietly the way her father had taught her, running her hand along his neck before she crouched down to look at the hoof. "He's going to be all right," said a voice from the stable doorway, and she stood quickly to find Jeremiah standing there with his own horse's bridle in his hand. "I checked on him earlier this morning when Pete couldn't come himself. Blacksmith is coming this afternoon." "I didn't know you'd already arranged it," she said. "Pete asked me last night," Jeremiah said, coming into the stable with the calm assurance of a man entirely in his element around horses. He ran his hand along Biscuit's side. "He's a good horse, just unlucky ground." He glanced at her. "You walked over here to check on him." "Pete is worried," she said simply. "Pete's a grown man with one working foot. He could have asked any of the others." "He did ask you," she pointed out. "He did," Jeremiah said, with a note of quiet acknowledgement. "And you came on your own without being asked." She was not sure what to do with the way he said that, with the simple directness of it, without decoration or teasing. She turned back to the horse and scratched behind his ear. "How long have you been making this drive?" she asked. 6 years, he said again. "Started when I was 24. It was the only work I could find after the ranch I was working went under." "And you've been doing it ever since?" "It pays," he said, "and I'm good at it." There was a pause. "But I've been saving," he added, and the word came out with a different weight to it, like it meant something bigger than just money set aside. "I want land of my own. Not much. Enough." "Enough for what?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that straightforward patience of his. "That's a question I'm still working out," he said. She nodded, understanding more in that than he probably thought she did. On Sunday, which was a quieter day in Caldwell because even the most enthusiastic drinkers needed one day of recovery, Susanna went to wash clothes at the well behind the boarding house and found that the rope on the bucket had frayed almost through. She went to the small shed for a replacement piece of rope and found it empty, and made a note to tell Clara. Then she filled her wash tub from the kitchen pump and set up in the back garden, working methodically through the pile. She had not been at it long when Jeremiah came around the corner of the building carrying a length of rope over his shoulder. "Mrs. Holt told me the bucket rope needed replacing," he said. He looked at her washtub full of sheets. "I'll stay out of your way." "You're not in my way," she said. He went to work on the well and she went back to her washing, and for a while neither of them spoke. The morning was warm, and a meadowlark was singing somewhere in the scrubby brush beyond the garden fence. And there was something about the combined sounds of the rope being worked and the water being wrung that was deeply ordinary and also, in a way she could not quite name, deeply peaceful. "Do you mind me asking," Jeremiah said, not looking up from his work, "what brought you to Caldwell?" She thought about the many ways she could answer that. "A practical decision," she said at last. "My husband died in February. I needed work and somewhere new. Mrs. Holt's advertisement was clear and offered a private room." He looked up at that, and his expression was careful and genuine in equal measure. "I'm sorry about your husband." "Thank you," she said. "He was a good man." It was a short marriage. We were learning each other still. She did not say more than that, and he did not push. He went back to the rope and she went back to the sheets, and after a moment he said, "My mother died when I was 12. My father when I was 19. The ranch I mentioned that went under, that was my father's place. After he died there was nothing to keep it going." "So you've been on your own since 19, she said. "Yes." She looked at the meadowlark, which had moved to the fence post and was bright and small and entirely indifferent to them. "That's a long time to manage alone." "It is," he said simply. That afternoon, Clara Holt asked Susanna to join her on the front porch for a glass of lemonade, which in Caldwell in the summer was a small luxury because lemons did not come cheap. They sat in the good chairs, and Clara rocked gently, and Susanna let her bonnet hang from her fingers and felt the air move. "Jeremiah Vaughn is a good man," Clara said, in the tone of someone beginning a conversation in the middle. Susanna looked at her sideways. "I'm sure he is." "He's been coming through for 6 years," Clara continued. "Never once was he any trouble. Pays on time, keeps his room clean, doesn't bring his drinking through my door. He's honest in a way that isn't common." She paused, rocking. "He's also the loneliest man I've encountered in a good long while, and I've been in this business long enough to know the difference between a man who prefers his own company and a man who simply hasn't found the right one to keep." Susanna set her lemonade glass on the porch railing with a deliberate click. "Mrs. Holt," she said. "I'm not matchmaking," Clara said serenely. "I'm simply observing, out loud. Because I think you might benefit from an honest outside observation, since you seem to be the type of woman who talks herself out of things before she's fully talked herself into them." Susanna considered this in silence. "I'm plain and ordinary," she said finally, and she said it the way she had said it all her life, not with bitterness but with the settled certainty of a fact long accepted. "I'm not the sort of woman that men like him look twice at." Clara stopped rocking. She looked at Susanna with the direct, unglamorous patience of a woman who has seen a great deal of life and has strong opinions about the lies it tells. "You are the most competent, warm, genuinely present woman who has walked through that door in 10 years, she said flatly. "And plain and ordinary is only a disadvantage if you believe it is." Susanna opened her mouth and closed it again. That evening at supper, all 6 boarders sat together, and the table was loud with the talk of the drive, something about a dispute over the count at the stockyard that had been resolved, and plans for the return journey, and Pete's ankle which was improving, though he was milking the sympathy considerably. Susanna served and listened the way she always did, and Tomas told a story about a longhorn that had gotten into a mercantile store in a town south of Abilene and eaten a bolt of calico before anyone could get to it. And the whole table laughed, and in the laughing Susanna laughed too, genuinely, because it was a genuinely funny story. She looked up from her laughter and found Jeremiah watching her with an expression she did not have a word for, and decided not to look for one. 2 evenings later, there was a dance. Caldwell had dances periodically, organized by the Ladies' Social Committee, held in the schoolhouse, and attended by everyone who could be dragged through the door. Clara considered them mandatory for her boarders because she sat on the social committee herself and attendance was a matter of household honor. Even Pete was hauled along on a borrowed crutch, cheerfully indignant and loudly grateful, which was a Pete-specific contradiction. Susanna had not been to a dance in over a year. She put on her better dress, which was a deep blue cotton with a white collar, and pinned her hair up slightly differently than usual, and looked in the small square of mirror above her washstand and told herself firmly that she looked perfectly presentable and completely ordinary, and that was sufficient. The schoolhouse was lit up, and the fiddle player was already in full voice when they arrived, and people were dancing in the cleared center of the room with the energetic, practical joy of people who worked hard and welcomed any excuse to be briefly unserious. Clara swept in and was immediately surrounded by committee members. Pete discovered a girl he knew from last season and forgot his crutch almost immediately, leaning on the wall next to her instead with a much better reason to stay in one place. Susanna found a seat along the side wall and watched, because watching was something she was genuinely good at and genuinely enjoyed. She watched the couples move, and the children run between people's knees, and the older men stand at the edges in a line of crossed arms and fond expressions. Jeremiah had come in after her, separately, and she was aware of him, the way you are aware of someone specific in a crowded room without quite looking at them, directly moving around the perimeter, exchanging a few words here and there, declining what was clearly an offer of whiskey from one of the other cowboys with an easy gesture. He came to stand near the wall about 5 feet from her, and they both watched the dancing for a time without speaking. "Do you dance?" he asked eventually. "I know how to," she said. "I haven't in some time." "Would you want to?" he asked, and his voice had that same quality it always had, not performing the question, just asking it. She looked at him. "I am not very graceful," she said, with the honest accuracy of a woman who has tripped over a dance partner's foot often enough to have accepted the reality. "Neither am I," he said. "We'd be even." She almost smiled. "All right," she said. He was not, in truth, graceful. He was a big man who moved with economy rather than elegance, and the Virginia reel was not a dance that suited either of them particularly well. But they kept time and they kept each other from stumbling, and when they came apart at the end of the figure and had to wait for the pattern to bring them back together, she found herself watching for him on the other side of the room the way you watch for something you did not know you were looking for. They danced twice. The second was a slower piece, and they stood closer, and she was aware of his hand at her back and of how solid and careful he was in every movement, as though he thought about what he was doing before he did it, which she understood because she was the same way. "You told me you weren't graceful," he said. "I'm not," she said. "You're wrong about that," he said simply, and did not elaborate. She was quiet for the rest of the song. Outside afterward, in the cooler dark of the Texas night leaking down from the north, Susanna stood for a moment on the schoolhouse steps and breathed. Clara was still inside. Jeremiah came out behind her and stood a step down, which put them at nearly the same height, and they both looked at the sky, which in Kansas away from the main street was spectacular, vast, and layered with stars in numbers that would have seemed unreal to anyone who had grown up in a city. "I've been on the trail 6 years," he said, "and the sky never stops being remarkable." "No," she agreed. There was a pause, and then he said, "I don't usually do a lot of talking." "I know," she said. "But I find it easier around you than with most people," he said. "I thought you should know that, because I think you're the kind of person who notices when something's different and doesn't say so." She turned her head to look at him and found him already looking at her, and the honesty in his expression was so complete and uncomplicated that she felt it land somewhere behind her sternum like a warm stone. "I notice," she said quietly. "I thought so," he said. She looked back at the stars. Her heart was doing something irregular that she did not think she should examine too carefully. "Mr. Vaughn," she began. "Jeremiah," he said. "Jeremiah," she said, and his name felt different in her mouth than she expected, more real somehow. "I should tell you something." "All right." "I'm plain and ordinary," she said, and she said it the same way she always did, with the quiet certainty of someone stating a fact that requires no defense. "I know that. I've always known it. I don't say it for sympathy. I say it because I think you should understand what I am and what I am not." Before she stopped. "Before what?" he asked. "Before whatever this is," she said, with a gesture between them that was small but that encompassed everything that had been building since the morning in the garden. He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to face her fully, and his expression was the most direct and serious she had ever seen on a human face, and he said, "Then I have been starving for ordinary." She stared at him. "Every year I come through towns like this one, he said, his voice steady and unhurried. "And I meet women who want something grand and dramatic and expensive, and men who perform at them like they're performing for a crowd. And I am so tired of all of it." He paused. "You sit in a garden before sunrise cutting herbs because you find it useful. You walk to a livery stable to check on a man's horse because he's worried. You read Dickens 3 times and you know what it's about. You dance even though you're not graceful because you were asked honestly." He looked at her with those steady brown eyes. "There is nothing ordinary about any of that. But if you insist on the word, then I have been starving for ordinary for a very long time." Susanna Yates had survived a great deal in her 24 years. She had buried her father and then her mother and then her husband. She had managed alone in cities and in the countryside. She had negotiated and compromised and adapted and been competent and careful and sensible and practical every single day of her adult life. She was not a woman who cried easily or often or in front of anyone. But standing on the schoolhouse steps in the warm Kansas night in 1879, she felt something shift in her chest that was old and tight and had been there so long she had stopped noticing it, and it loosened slightly and she breathed. "You don't know me very well," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "No," he agreed, "but I would like to." She looked at him for a long moment. "So would I," she said at last. "I would like to know you as well." The dance behind them went on, the fiddle high and bright through the schoolhouse walls, and the stars overhead were enormous and indifferent and beautiful. And Susanna thought that, for a woman who had been certain she was going to disappear quietly into this new life without making a ripple, she was suddenly making a ripple. In the days that followed, things between them progressed in the slow, deliberate way of 2 careful people who had both been hurt by loss and were not inclined to rush. There were morning conversations in the garden, which became a habit for both of them without either of them deciding it would be so. There were evenings on the porch where the cool air came at last, and the noise of Caldwell settled slightly, and they sat in adjacent chairs with their coffee, and talked about the kinds of things that seemed small, but were not what they thought about fairness and about hard work, and about what made a place feel like home. Susanna learned that Jeremiah had grown up in the hill country of Texas, that his father had been a rancher of modest ambitions and steady character who had died of a heart ailment, that his mother had been a schoolteacher before she married, and had raised Jeremiah with books and clear opinions, which explained both the Dickens and the way he listened. She learned that he had a deep practical knowledge of cattle and of land and of horses, and that he also had opinions about soil quality and water rights, and the right way to build a windbreak that he had acquired through years of observation, and that he delivered with the authority of a man who had earned his knowledge the long way. He learned that she could make a dress from less cloth than most people would consider adequate, that she could calculate figures in her head faster than most men could on paper, that she had a laugh that came from somewhere genuine and low and was worth working for, and that she had very firm opinions about Dickens and slightly more complicated ones about the current state of Kansas politics. He also learned, gradually, that she had been lonely. Not in the dramatic, operatic way that some people wore their loneliness like a flag, but in the bone-deep, quiet way of someone who had been useful to many people and genuinely known by very few. One afternoon, Susanna was in the parlor mending the sleeve of a canvas jacket when Clara came in with a letter. She set it on the side table next to Susanna's elbow with the careful air of someone delivering news they are unsure about. "It's from your husband's family," Clara said. "Came through the post." Susanna looked at the letter without touching it for a moment. Her late husband's family, a sister in St. Louis named Martha, and a mother who had never entirely warmed to Susanna, had been quiet since the funeral, and she had been quietly grateful. She opened the letter with her sewing scissors and read it in 3 careful passes. Martha Coles, her sister-in-law, was writing to inform her that their mother, who had handled the family finances, had determined that Susanna's claim to the remainder of her husband's modest savings was, in the family's opinion not as settled as Susanna had understood it to be from the lawyer. They were requesting that Susanna return to St. Louis to discuss the matter formally. Susanna folded the letter and set it in her lap. She sat with it for a moment, measuring the situation. She was not going back to St. Louis. That was the first clear thought. But she also understood that she needed to write a very precise and legally grounded letter to the family lawyer, and she needed to do it quickly. She was drafting the letter that evening, careful and firm and without hostility, at the parlor desk when Jeremiah came through on his way to the porch. He paused when he saw her expression. "Trouble?" he asked. She told him briefly. He listened without interrupting, which she had come to expect from him, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. "Have you seen the lawyer here in Caldwell?" he asked. "Henderson on the main road keeps a good practice. I've used him for a land matter. I wasn't sure a local lawyer could address a St. Louis estate matter," she said. "He can write the letter with the right referencing and make clear that you are represented," Jeremiah said. "It'll carry more weight than a letter written alone. They're trying to intimidate you into coming back in person because a person in the room is easier to manage than a firm letter from a lawyer." She looked at him. "You know this. I watched my father lose a land dispute because he thought being in the right was enough," he said quietly. "Being right isn't always sufficient. Documentation and representation are." She let out a slow breath. "You're right. Will you go see Henderson tomorrow?" "Yes," she said. "I will." "Good." He moved to go and then paused. "For what it's worth," he said, "anyone who tries to take what you're owed from you is making a mistake. You don't look like the type who loses." "I don't intend to," she said. She went to Henderson the next morning, and he was indeed capable and practical, and the letter he helped her draft was clear and legally precise, and referenced the original settlement document that she had kept carefully in her bag, because she was a woman who kept important documents carefully. Henderson sent it through the proper channels, and Susanna paid his modest fee from her own purse without complaint. 3 weeks later, she received a letter from the St. Louis lawyer confirming that the estate matter was settled in her favor, and she folded that letter and set it in the same place, and breathed the same slow breath she breathed when something difficult was resolved. She told Jeremiah that evening, and he said, "Good," with a satisfaction that was not about himself, but about justice being done, and she thought she might be in a great deal of trouble when it came to this man. The days had been counting down without anyone saying so. The cattle sale had concluded well, and the drive was preparing to head back to Texas. Jeremiah had a job waiting for the return trip that he had committed to before the season began. There was no avoiding the fact of his departure. They both knew it, and neither of them spoke of it directly for a long time, and then one evening, it was the last full day before the departing group would leave, they were sitting on the porch after supper, and the rest of the boarders had drifted inside or to the saloon, and the quiet was the particular quality of a quiet that contains many things. "I'll be back in the spring," he said. "I know," she said. The night air moved between them, warm and smelling of dust and the far-off cattle pens. She kept her eyes forward because she thought if she looked at him she might say something she was not ready to say. "Susanna," he said. She looked at him. His face in the lamplight from the parlor window was serious and open, and she knew him well enough by now, nearly 4 weeks of morning conversations and shared suppers and those long porch evenings, to read the particular quality of his expression. "I don't want to leave things unspoken," he said. "I'm not a man who does that well. Unsaid things have a way of becoming permanent." "No," she agreed quietly. "They do. I care about you," he said, plainly and without performance. "More than I've cared about anyone in a long while. I know this is fast, and I know you've had loss recently, and I don't want to pressure you into something you're not ready for. But I need you to know that what I feel is real, and when I come back in the spring it won't be just because of the trail." She was quiet for a long moment. Inside the house, she could hear Clara moving around in the kitchen, the distant sound of Mr. Fenwick's door closing on the upper floor, Pete laughing at something from the front room. "I'll be here," she said at last, and the simplicity of it was enormous. He nodded once, and then, with the care he brought to everything he did, he reached across the space between their chairs and covered her hand with his. His hand was warm and roughened and steady, and she turned her palm up and he held it, and they sat like that in the Kansas night without saying anything else because nothing else needed saying. He left in the morning before she was properly awake. Though she was awake, she had barely slept, and from her window she watched him saddle his horse in the pre-dawn dark with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done it 1,000 times. He looked up once at the house, not specifically at her window, just up, the way you look up at something you are leaving. Then he mounted and rode to join the others at the edge of town, and Susanna watched him go until the dark took him completely. She pressed her hand flat against the glass of the window for a moment. Then she turned and made the bed with precise corners and went downstairs to help Clara with the breakfast. The fall came down over Kansas like a long, golden settling. The cattle season ended and Caldwell returned to its quieter self, the main street still active, the saloons still open, but the particular noise and energy of the drive subsided and the town breathed. Pete and Tomas and Enrique and Sutter all rode out with the return trip, and Holt's boarding house took on new long-term residents, a surveyor from Topeka, and a dry goods merchant waiting out the winter before opening his store in the spring. Susanna wrote to Jeremiah once, because she thought she should, and then spent 3 days deciding whether to send the letter before Clara appeared at her doorway while she was holding the sealed envelope and said, "For the love of common sense, Susanna, send the letter." And she sent the letter. She wrote about the fall colors and the way Mrs. Fenwick had sent her husband a box of gingerbread from Topeka, and how it had made the whole boarding house smell extraordinary for a full day. She wrote about the Henderson lawyer having concluded her estate matter entirely, and how she had used a portion of the recovered funds to buy herself a proper sewing table, second-hand but solid, which she had wanted for years. She wrote about the meadowlark that had come to the back garden fence every morning through October and then one day simply didn't come back, and how she hadn't expected to feel the absence of a bird so particularly. She wrote none of the things she actually wanted to say, and then at the very end, before signing it, she added one more line. "I find myself looking forward to spring in a way I have not looked forward to a season in some time." She sealed it again immediately before she could reconsider and mailed it. His letter came 3 weeks later. It was not long. He was not a man who wrote long letters, she suspected, any more than he was a man who talked unnecessarily, but what was there was clear and warm and entirely Jeremiah. He wrote that the return trip had been uneventful except for a creek crossing that had been more ambitious than expected. He wrote that he was now settled into the winter work on a large ranch in the Texas Panhandle, mending fences and managing the horses through the cold months. He wrote that he had been thinking about land, that he had spoken to a man who knew of a quarter section available for reasonable purchase north of the Panhandle, good grass, reliable water from a creek, room enough for a modest operation if managed carefully. He wrote that he had never wanted anything so much as he had wanted that land, except that lately he was finding his thinking about the land was entangled with his thinking about other things, and that he hoped she understood what he meant by that because he was not yet certain he could say it more directly without it sounding as presumptuous as he feared it might. She read that paragraph twice and understood it entirely. Clara found her sitting in the parlor with the letter in her lap, and an expression that Clara later described to Miss Dolly Carr as a woman coming back to life, which was perhaps dramatic, but was not entirely inaccurate. Winter in Caldwell was cold and quiet and long, and Susanna worked and thought and waited in equal measure. She did alterations for several of the town's women, who were glad to have a skilled seamstress available through the quiet months, and she charged fair prices and did excellent work and built a small but steady reputation. She started teaching a twice-weekly sewing class for younger women at the schoolhouse, which Miss Dolly approved of and helped organize, and which gave Susanna more human connection than she had realized she was missing. She and Jeremiah exchanged 4 more letters through the winter months. Each one grew slightly more direct. His third letter mentioned, quite casually and in the context of discussing the quarter section of land, that the house that could be built there was small, but that small houses could be made into homes by the right people. Her response, equally casual, mentioned that she had always preferred practical spaces to grand ones, and that she had learned from watching Clara Holt that a boarding house full of warm light and good food and honest work was more of a home than any mansion she had read about. His fourth letter was the shortest. It said, "I will be in Caldwell before the drive comes through. I am coming earlier this time. I thought you should know that." She read it standing at the kitchen table and sat down slowly in Clara's chair, and Clara, who was chopping potatoes at the counter, said without turning around, "Good news." "Yes," Susanna said. "Good," said Clara. He arrived on a Thursday morning in late April 1880, 2 full weeks before the main drive was expected in Caldwell, and he came alone on his horse with his gear, and a particular look in his eyes that Susanna saw from the window above the garden before she went down to meet him. She went out the back door into the garden because she was not a woman who ran to front doors, and he came around the side of the house having stabled his horse, and they met in the garden in the morning light where they had first stood together, and she thought this was the right place for it. "You're early," she said. "Yes," he said. He looked tired from the road, but otherwise exactly himself. That steadiness, that patience, those clear brown eyes. "I wanted time." "Time for what?" she asked. "To do this properly," he said. He had spoken to Clara before he arrived. She learned this later, because Clara was absolutely the sort of person who required formal consultation before matters of this kind proceeded under her roof. He had written to Clara in February, which Susanna had not known, and asked whether he might be permitted to court Susanna properly when he came in the spring. Clara had written back to say that she thought this was an admirable intention, and that Susanna would not be pressured or pushed in any direction by anyone, but that if Susanna was amenable, Clara would be happy to allow it. This explained Clara's expression when Jeremiah came through the front door the previous afternoon to arrange his room, a knowing, deeply pleased expression that Clara had tried to conceal, and had done a very poor job of concealing. The courtship, such as it was in practical Caldwell in 1880, consisted primarily of exactly what they had always done: morning conversations and evening porch sitting and long talks, and the occasional dance at the schoolhouse, and the particular intimacy of 2 people who genuinely liked each other's company better than any other available company. He brought her wildflowers once, the spare prairie kind that grew in the grass north of town, and she put them in the blue pitcher in the parlor, and Clara pointed them out to every single person who came through the front door, which was embarrassing and also not entirely unpleasant. They walked along the creek one Sunday afternoon, the shallow, reed-edged creek that ran a quarter mile out of town, and she told him about her early life more completely than she had told anyone, about her father's farm and her mother's illness, and the small inheritance that had been mostly spent on her mother's care, and then her husband's funeral, and about the particular quality of her loneliness that came not from lack of company, but from the consistent feeling of being incompletely seen. "Not once," she said, with the steady voice she used for hard truths, "in all my life has anyone looked at me and thought, there is someone worth knowing fully. I was useful to people. I was competent and calm and available, but I was never the one anyone would cross a room for." He stopped walking. She stopped because he did. "Susanna," he said, "I came to Caldwell 2 weeks early." She looked at him. "I came 2 weeks early," he said again, "by myself, without the drive, without any other reason, because of you." She was quiet for a long moment. The creek moved past them in its quiet way, and a red-winged blackbird called from the reeds, and the sky was the particular blue of a Kansas spring afternoon that had no equal. "I'm not good at believing good things easily," she said. I want you to know that. It's not that I don't trust you. It's that I've built a very sturdy case against expecting them. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to stop building the case. I'm asking you to let me keep being the evidence that contradicts it. She laughed, that real, low laugh that he had said was worth working for, and she turned her face toward the creek so he wouldn't see that her eyes had gone bright. He reached for her hand and she gave it to him, and they walked back toward town together in the afternoon light. And she thought that something had changed, that some long-held tension in her had finally and fundamentally begun to release. The drive arrived in the third week of May, not Jeremiah's usual outfit, but a different one passing through, which filled Holt's and every other establishment in Caldwell to capacity, and raised the noise and the dust, and the particular atmosphere of cattle season to its full, clamorous expression. Jeremiah worked during the days at the stockyard, where he had found temporary employment as a cattle assessor, because his years of experience made him useful, and his reputation was good. But the evenings were theirs, and they used them carefully and well. One evening in the second week of June, they were sitting on the porch later than usual. The other boarders had gone to bed and Clara had tactfully taken herself off, which Susanna noted and appreciated, and the moon was up and the town had quieted down, and Jeremiah was quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. She waited because she had learned to read his silences. "I've put money down on the land," he said at last. She turned to look at him. "The quarter section in the Panhandle?" "Yes," he said. "The deed comes through in August. The current holder is giving me until then to complete the purchase and he's holding it." He looked at his hands. "I have enough saved for the land and for materials to build a small house, not a grand one." "I've already said I don't need grand," she said. He looked at her with an expression that was absolutely everything. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm telling you." The silence between them breathed. "Susanna," he said, "I would like to ask you something very directly." "I wish you would," she said, because she was tired of speaking around it. "Will you marry me?" he asked. "I know the land is not much yet, and the house is not built yet, and I am asking you to trust a plan more than a finished thing. But I am asking you because I cannot imagine building any of it without you being the reason. I don't want ordinary days without you. I want ordinary days with you, everyone." She had prepared herself, in the way she prepared herself for most things, for this moment. She had thought through every practical consideration and every emotional one, and she had arrived at her conclusion weeks ago, though she had waited for him to ask because he was the kind of man who needed to ask in his own time and in the right way, and she was the kind of woman who respected that. "Yes," she said, "I will." He reached across and took both her hands in his, and she looked at their joined hands in the moonlight, his large and roughened and warm, her smaller and just as roughened, and she thought that they looked exactly right together. He raised her hands to his lips and kissed them, both of them, with a reverence that undid her more than anything dramatic ever could have, and she thought, "There it is. There is the thing I did not believe was coming." They were married in early August 1880, on a morning when the Kansas sky was high and cloudless, and the heat was fierce but bearable. They were married in the Caldwell church during one of the traveling preacher's visits, which was arranged by Clara with the organizational precision she brought to everything. Clara herself stood with Susanna, and Pete, who had come back through on a different drive, and heard the news with such enthusiasm that he had barely left town before insisting on staying for it, stood with Jeremiah. Susanna wore her blue dress, altered at the collar and cuffs with the best lace she owned, which was not very much lace but which was real and carefully worked. She carried prairie wildflowers because Jeremiah had brought them to her that morning, a handful from the same creek where they had walked, and she had laughed and taken them and carried them through the ceremony. Miss Dolly Carr cried. Mr. Fenwick produced a small flask from his vest pocket at the celebration afterward, which Clara confiscated and replaced with a bottle of proper elderflower wine she had been saving, and which turned out to be deeply better. They stayed 2 more weeks in Caldwell while Jeremiah concluded his work at the stockyard, And then in late August, they loaded their belongings into a hired wagon and started south toward the Texas Panhandle, toward the land that was now legally Jeremiah Vaughn's, and therefore legally both of theirs. Clara stood on the porch of Holt's boarding house and watched them go, and she did not cry because Clara was not a woman who cried, but she held her handkerchief quite tightly and waved with great feeling. The journey to the Panhandle took the better part of 2 weeks, camping along the way in the manner of people who were entirely capable of managing themselves in the open country. Susanna was not romantic about camping. It was dusty and uncomfortable, and the nights were cold in ways she had to adapt to quickly, but she was practical about it, which was better than romantic anyway. She could start a fire with efficiency and cook over it adequately, and she could read a sky's weather intentions almost as well as Jeremiah could, which he noticed and commented on. "Where did you learn that?" he asked one afternoon when she had predicted a rain that came in just as she said it would. "My father," she said. "He said the sky was a language and you might as well learn to read it." "He sounds like a good man," Jeremiah said. "He was," she said. "You would have liked him." She thought about it. "He would have liked you." Jeremiah reached across from his horse to touch her shoulder briefly, the way he touched things he cared about, with intention and economy and warmth. They arrived at the quarter section on a bright September morning, and Susanna looked at what was there. A flat expanse of grass stretching to a gentle rise in the west, the creek running along the eastern edge with the cottonwoods growing beside it, and nothing else yet, and felt something she had not expected to feel, which was recognition. It was completely empty and it was entirely theirs, and the emptiness was not frightening to her. She had never been afraid of things that needed doing. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. "Where does the house go?" she asked. He pointed to a spot on the gentle rise slightly above the flat, sheltered from the north by the land's own elevation. "There," he said. "Good drainage and sight lines in 3 directions." "Yes," she said, seeing it immediately. "That's right." They set up camp that first night under the cottonwoods by the creek, and Susanna lay on her back in the bedroll and looked up through the cottonwood leaves at the massive sky above them. And she felt the full weight of what she had done left everything familiar, come to a piece of empty ground at the edge of the known world. And she felt, beneath the weight of it, something solid and steady. And she knew it was the same thing that had been in his voice the night he had told her he had been starving for ordinary. It was the particular piece of a right decision, arrived at through the right reasons. "Jeremiah," she said quietly. "I'm here," he said from beside her. "I'm glad I came to Caldwell," she said. "So am I," he said. "More than I know how to say." "You don't need to say it," she said. "You came 2 weeks early." She heard him laugh softly in the dark, that rare, genuine laugh that was her own equivalent of the one he had said was worth working for, and she smiled at the cottonwood leaves above her and the stars beyond them, and she slept. Building the house took the fall and early winter, with help from a neighboring family, the Briggses, 3 miles west along the same creek, who were the kind of frontier people who understood that neighbors helping neighbors was not charity but simple sense. James Briggs and his 2 grown sons came over 4 days in October and helped raise the walls, and Susanna fed them all enormously from the camp stove, and the provisions she had organized with characteristic thoroughness. And Mrs. Martha Briggs came with them and sat with Susanna on a blanket outside while the men worked, and they talked in the easy, careful way of 2 women beginning a friendship, and finding it likely to be a good one. The house was small, 2 rooms, with a sleeping loft above that could be partitioned later if needed, a proper fireplace that Jeremiah and James Briggs built with particular care, and a window on the south side that caught the winter sun. There was a root cellar dug before the freeze and a linta for the horses and the 2 milk cows that Susanna had been very firm about acquiring. "We need reliable milk," she had said. "We need more horses first," he had said. "We need both," she had said, and that was how that had gone. The winter was hard. The Texas Panhandle winter of 1880 into 1881 was not a gentle one, And there were weeks when the cold came down from the north in a way that made the walls of the small house seem like nothing and the fireplace the most important thing in the world. But the house held and the chimney drew well, and they had laid in enough provisions to last through the harshest weeks. And Jeremiah had managed the horses and livestock through worse, and knew how to read, when a blizzard was coming with enough lead time to prepare. There were difficult days when the isolation pressed in, when the wind was unceasing and the gray sky seemed permanent, when the small space of the house was intimate in ways that required both of them to be patient and flexible and honest, which was not always easy. They were two people who had been alone a long time and had their habits and their edges, and they discovered this about each other in the compressed and honest way of a first winter together. One February evening when the wind had been going for 3 days and Susanna was at the end of her patience with it, she said something sharp about a matter that was not really about the thing she said it about, and Jeremiah was quiet for a moment and then said, "Are you talking about the firewood or about something else?" She put down the pot she was holding and stood with her hands at her sides and said, "The wind." "The wind," he said. "Yes," she said. "I cannot stand it today, and I don't know why today is different from yesterday except that today it is." He got up from the table where he had been going over figures, and he came to where she was standing by the stove, and he put his arms around her from behind, careful and firm, and held her. He didn't say anything clever or reassuring. He just held on. She pressed her hands over his where they clasped at her middle and breathed. "Thank you," she said after a while. "The wind is unreasonable," he said. "You're allowed to be tired of it." She laughed, which was not what she expected, and he laughed quietly against her hair, and the wind battered the outside of the walls, and they were inside them together, and it was enough. Spring came late, but it came, green and extraordinary, the way the Texas plains went from brown to green in what seemed like a matter of days. They planted a kitchen garden in April. Susanna was organized and decisive about what went where, and Jeremiah built the beds with the thoroughness he brought to all physical work. And the garden grew with the generous enthusiasm of land that had been resting a long time. They had neighbors for the garden plot's first harvest in the form of a prairie dog colony that had discovered the beans, which led to an extended tactical campaign that Susanna prosecuted with grim efficiency and ultimate success, and which became a story they told for years. By the spring of 1881, Jeremiah had taken on work with a larger outfit a day's ride west, not the driving work but ranch management, which used his knowledge better and kept him home more reliably. The ranch owner, a man named Aldous Croft who was honest in business and demanded the same from everyone around him, paid Jeremiah fairly and respected his judgment. The work was enough to expand the operation slowly: another cow, a better breeding bull, more fencing, a second room added to the house when summer came, and the construction was possible. In early June of 1881, Susanna confirmed what she had quietly suspected for 6 weeks, which was that she was expecting a child. She told Jeremiah on the porch in the evening, as the sun went down over the rise to the west and turned everything amber. She said it plainly and directly because that was how she said things, and she watched his face as she said it, which was a remarkable experience because Jeremiah Vaughn's face was not a face that typically moved through many expressions quickly. And in the moment after she told him, it did something she had never quite seen it do before, which was to become entirely open and unguarded and incandescent. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead to hers, and they sat like that for a long moment in the warm evening air, her hands between both of his, and she could feel his breath and his heartbeat, and the slight trembling in his hands that he was not attempting to control. "I did not know," he said softly, "how much I wanted this until you just told me." "I know," she said. "I felt the same way." He lifted his head and looked at her with those clear brown eyes, and they were bright. "Are you well?" he asked. "How are you feeling?" "Tired," she said honestly, "and rather extraordinary." "You are extraordinary," he said, and he meant it in the exact sense he always meant it, without flattery, as a simple statement of observed fact, and she received it that way finally without arguing with it. Their son was born in January of 1882 in the house on the Gentle Rise, attended by Mrs. Martha Briggs, who had delivered a number of babies in her time and was entirely calm and practical about the whole affair, which Susanna was deeply grateful for. It was a hard birth, long and tiring in the way of first births, and Jeremiah sat outside the bedroom door for 7 hours and wore a noticeable path in the boards, which Susanna heard about afterward from Martha with great entertainment. They named the boy Samuel, after Susanna's father, and the middle name was Thomas, after no one in particular but because it went well with Samuel and with Vaughn, and because they both liked it. Samuel Vaughn came into the world loud and determined, and with a great deal of dark hair, and Jeremiah held him for the first time with the expression of a man discovering a previously unknown fact about the nature of love, which was that it expanded without limit and without warning. "He looks like you," Jeremiah said. "He looks like a baby," Susanna said, with the loving and practical accuracy of a woman who had just spent 7 hours laboring and had no patience for romantic imprecision. "A very beautiful baby," Jeremiah said firmly. "Yes," she agreed, and meant it entirely. The years on the Vaughn land settled into a rhythm that Susanna had not known she was capable of sustaining, and which turned out to be the foundation of everything she had always wanted without having the vocabulary for it. Work and purpose and beauty in the ordinary things, and a man beside her who was present and genuine, and loved her in the specific, attentive way that meant he knew what she needed before she always said it, and said it plainly when she did say it. In 1883, their daughter arrived, Eleanor Briggs Vaughn, who earned the middle name because Martha Briggs had again been present and essential, and because it seemed right to honor the woman who had stood with them at both of their children's beginnings. Eleanor was born in the spring and came into the world quietly, looking at everything with the same considering, careful expression her mother wore, and Jeremiah said within the first hour that she would be a person of strong opinions, which turned out to be accurate. By 1884, the operation on the rise above the creek had grown considerably. There were 30 head of cattle and a small horse-breeding enterprise that Jeremiah had started on the strength of his reputation for knowing horses, and the house had been expanded to 3 rooms on the ground floor, and the loft properly divided into 2 sleeping spaces, and the kitchen garden had become a kitchen and a side garden, and a small orchard of young apple trees whose first fruit was a matter of enormous celebration. The life was not easy. The Texas Panhandle did not offer easy as one of its available options. There were dry years and harsh winters and a cattle disease in the fall of 1884 that took 7 of their 30 head and left them leaner than they liked, though they managed through it. There were the ordinary difficulties of 2 adults building a life together, the disagreements about money and priorities, and the right way to manage a difficult neighbor situation. These were real and sometimes sharp, but they had the habit, both of them, of speaking honestly rather than letting things accumulate, which was possibly the most useful thing either of them had learned in their lives, and which they had found in each other like a mirror of the same instinct. Susanna had never in her life been what the world would call remarkable. She knew this, and she had, over the years, made a different peace with it than the one she had made before, not the resigned peace of someone who has accepted a limitation, but the richer peace of someone who has understood that the world's definitions of remarkable are frequently wrong. She was the person who noticed that the youngest Briggs boy was struggling at the schoolwork that the Briggs children now received from Miss Dolly Carr's successor in the nearest small town, and who quietly organized a weekly reading session that helped him. She was the person who figured out that the water trouble they had one dry summer was coming from the upper section of the creek, and proposed the solution to redirect the flow, which worked. She was the person who kept the figures for 3 of the neighboring families who trusted her arithmetic more than their own, and who organized the collective purchase of supplies from Caldwell that saved each family a season's worth of freight costs. She was, in short, exactly what she had always been: plain and ordinary in the way that the world meant it, and extraordinary in every way that actually counted. One evening in the fall of 1885, when Samuel was 3 and Eleanor was 2, and Jeremiah had come in from the long work of the day, and washed his face and hands at the basin, and sat down at the table where Susanna was nursing Eleanor with one arm and reading a letter from Clara Holt with the other hand. He looked at her across the lamplight with an expression she had seen on his face 100 times by now and loved every single time. "What?" she said, without looking up from the letter. "Nothing," he said. "I'm just looking at you." "I know," she said. "I can feel it." He leaned his elbows on the table. "Clara doing well, very well. She says she's thinking of expanding the boarding house by 2 rooms. Also, Pete married the girl he met at that dance in Caldwell in 1879, and they have a 3rd child on the way." "Pete," Jeremiah said, with the fond incredulity the name always seemed to inspire. "Pete," she agreed. She finished the letter and folded it, and Eleanor had fallen asleep in the warm way of small children who decide very suddenly and completely to be unconscious, and Susanna settled her more securely and looked across the table at her husband. "I got a letter from the Henderson lawyer as well," she said. "Oh, the estate matter with my late husband's family. They've all concluded it, finally and formally. Martha Coles wrote me a letter that is as close to an apology as I think she is capable of. It's done." He nodded with that quiet satisfaction. "Good." "Yes," she said. "Good." She looked at the lamp, at the steady, warm flame of it. "I was thinking today about when I arrived in Caldwell," she said. "The first day, standing on the boardwalk with my bags." "Were you frightened?" he asked. "Not exactly frightened," she said. I thought I was going to disappear. That I was going to be useful and competent and invisible, the way I had always been, and that was the life I was going to have, and I should be grateful for it because a great many women had less. And now," he said. She looked at him and at the sleeping child in her arm and at the house around them, small and warm and built stone by stone and board by board from nothing and from everything. "Now I think I was wrong about myself," she said. "I think I always was. I just needed someone who could see it." "You didn't need me to see it," he said gently. "It was always there. He paused, looking for the right words with the deliberateness he brought to things that mattered. "I just had the good fortune to be paying attention." She smiled at him. That full, real smile that he had said 100 times was the thing he looked for above all others in a room. And he smiled back, and it was quiet between them in the way of all the good quiets they had built together, the kind that didn't need filling. Outside, the Texas sky was enormous and full of stars, the same sky she had stared up through the cottonwood leaves on their first night on this land, and the same sky Jeremiah had looked at 100 times on the trail before he had anyone to come home to. The wind moved across the grass and around the house, and the horses were settled in the lean-to, and Samuel was asleep in the loft, and Eleanor was asleep in her arm, and the lamp burned steady on the table between them. She set down the letters and reached across the table, and he met her hand there, the same way they had met the first time he had reached for her on that long-ago Kansas porch, and he held on with the same warmth and the same steadiness that had never once wavered in all the time she had known him. "Jeremiah," she said. "I know," he said. "I was going to say thank you," she said. "What for?" "For coming 2 weeks early," she said. He laughed, that real, low laugh that she had worked for and won and kept, and the sound of it moved through the warm room and out into the wide Texas night, and Susanna Yates Vaughn, who had once stood on a boardwalk in Caldwell and believed she was destined to be invisible, held her daughter and her husband's hand and was entirely, completely, extraordinarily seen. In the spring of 1886, they planted the 4th row of apple trees, and the orchard began to look like what it was always supposed to be, a real, living thing that would outlast the planting of it. Samuel helped with a small spade, and Alina supervised from the fence post with the authority of a person twice her age. And Jeremiah lifted Alina down from the post and spun her once in the warm spring air, and she screamed with delight. And Susanna watched from the edge of the kitchen garden with her hand shading her eyes against the bright morning sun, and her heart so full she could not have put words to it if she had tried. She did not try. She was not a woman who needed to put words to everything. Some things were complete in themselves: a man spinning a laughing child in the sunshine, a boy digging with a small spade in the good earth, a house on a rise above a creek, an orchard coming into its own, a life built from almost nothing by two people who had found in each other the extraordinary in the ordinary. She walked back to the garden and knelt in the warm dirt and planted the seeds she had been carrying in her apron pocket. And behind her the sound of her family in the spring morning went on, bright and real and full of all the ordinary joy she had once been told she should not expect, and which she now knew, with the settled certainty of a woman who had lived it, was the finest thing the world had to offer.